The alarms began just after midnight. Deep inside the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe, engineers watched in horror as the screens went black. The external power grid, the lifeline that kept the reactors cool, had gone down. Pumps slowed, backup systems strained, and then the silence was broken by the low, stuttering rumble of emergency diesel generators. The plant's last defense had been activated. But almost immediately there was trouble. Of the aging generators, one failed to start. Another sputtered under the weight of demand, coughing smoke into the night. For the men and women inside the control rooms, the memory of Chernobyl was no longer history. It was alive, breathing down their necks, threatening to repeat itself in real time. Outside the fences, the war pressed closer. The distant rumble of artillery echoed across the night, flashes of light illuminating the cooling towers like ghostly silhouettes. Shells had already fallen near the power lines days earlier, severing connections one by one until the plant was forced into isolation. Now, with one generator down, the margin of safety had vanished. If the others failed, the reactors would begin to overheat. If cooling was lost for hours, Europe could face a catastrophe that might rival the darkest days of the nuclear age. Ukrainian officials rushed to warn the world. In Kyiv, the message was blunt. The plant is at the edge of disaster. Emergency crews scrambled to repair power lines under fire, risking their lives to reconnect a grid that could prevent meltdown. Local civilians packed bags, waiting for evacuation orders, while whispers spread across villages. Would this be another Chernobyl, or something even worse? In the dim light of the control room, exhausted engineers watched gauges and dials, their faces pale as they checked fuel levels. Diesel was running low. Every hour, the math grew tighter, the window shorter. They knew what would happen if the generator stopped. They had seen it before in history books, in grainy footage of men in radiation suits standing over burning reactors. But this was not the past. This was happening now, in the middle of a war. And before we go further, let me ask you this. Where are you watching from? Because if Zaporizhzhia fails, it will not be Ukraine alone that suffers. The winds do not care about borders, and the fallout of one night could spread across continents. Drop your country in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed, because this crisis is far from over, and the next blackout could be the one that changes everything. The night stretched on, the generators rumbling like tired giants, the plant trembling on the edge of silence. For millions beyond its walls, the danger was invisible. But for those inside, it was the sound of history repeating, one flickering light bulb at a time. The Zaporizhzhia plant was never designed to stand alone. Its 6 reactors were built with the assumption that an external power grid would always feed electricity into their veins. That power kept the cooling systems alive, the pumps moving, the heat of the reactors under control. Without it, the cores would boil themselves into catastrophe. Now, with the grid severed by shelling, the entire complex depended on a handful of diesel generators. They were meant as a last resort, a temporary bridge until power lines were restored. But the war had turned them into the only barrier between safety and disaster. Fuel reserves were measured in days, sometimes hours, depending on the demand. One generator had already failed. Others groaned as though each minute might be their last. Engineers worked under suffocating pressure. They checked valves, rewired circuits, and measured fuel tanks by flashlight. Every gauge told the same story. The plant was alive, but barely. If the remaining generators failed, even for a few hours, water would stop flowing through the reactors. The heat would rise, unstoppable. Pressure would build. Containment would strain. The nightmare everyone whispered, meltdown, would no longer be theory. In the nearby city of Enerhodar, the fear was visible in the faces of ordinary people. Parents packed their children into cars, ready to flee at the sound of sirens. Pharmacies ran out of iodine tablets within hours. Streets were filled with rumors. Was this the night the reactors would explode? The night Europe would face another radioactive cloud drifting across borders and seas? Ukrainian authorities pleaded for international attention. "We are closer to a nuclear disaster than at any time since Chernobyl," one official warned. Their words cut through the static of war, reaching ears in Brussels, Washington, and Vienna. At the headquarters of the International Atomic Energy Agency, analysts pored over satellite images, helpless to intervene as artillery shells cratered the Earth around high-voltage lines. The plant itself was a paradox, massive yet fragile. Its concrete walls could withstand blasts, but not the silence of failed machinery. Its towers rose into the sky, yet its fate hinged on the sputter of old engines, drinking fuel faster than it could be delivered. And all the while, the fighting continued. Trucks carrying repair crews were turned back by gunfire. Power lines, once repaired, were cut again by the next round of shelling. The plant was trapped in a cycle of crisis, barely surviving each blackout before another began. Inside the control room, the mood was quiet but heavy. Men and women who had spent their lives mastering the science of nuclear power now fought a battle against time, machines, and war. They knew the plant could not endure endless isolation. They knew that every blackout pushed it closer to the point of no return. The truth was brutal. Zaporizhzhia was not just a Ukrainian problem. It was a global one. Radiation respected no borders, no flags, no alliances. If the cooling stopped, if the fuel ran out, the fallout could drift across Europe, poisoning land, water, and lives for generations. The crisis was no longer measured in years or even months. It was measured in hours, in the rhythm of failing machines, in the thin line between hum and silence. And the world watched, waiting to see if the largest nuclear plant in Europe would hold or break. The warnings from Zaporizhzhia carried a weight that went beyond the present. Every whisper of failure, every rumor of meltdown awakened ghosts that Europe thought it had buried decades ago. To many, the name Chernobyl still burns with fear. The silent killer, the invisible cloud of radiation drifting across borders, poisoning land and people for generations. And now, in the same country, history seemed to be circling back, threatening to repeat itself in an even darker way. The engineers inside Zaporizhzhia knew what Chernobyl had meant. They had studied the footage of firefighters climbing onto the roof of Reactor 4, unaware that every breath was death. They had memorized the stories of entire towns evacuated overnight, of children lined up for iodine tablets, of mothers leaving homes forever, their belongings abandoned to radioactive dust. To them, the idea of another meltdown was not abstract. It was real, personal, and closer than anyone wanted to admit. But Zaporizhzhia's danger was not only Chernobyl's ghost. Another specter haunted the world. Hiroshima. Not because Zaporizhzhia was a bomb. Its reactors could not unleash the same kind of instant destruction. But because in a war zone, surrounded by artillery and drones, one strike on its reactors or fuel storage could scatter radioactive fire across Europe like a weapon. A deliberate act of war could turn a power plant into something resembling the devastation of a nuclear blast. Not in a single blinding flash, but in a slow, cruel storm of poison spreading across air and water. The comparison terrified diplomats. Was this crisis a repeat of Chernobyl? A slow-motion disaster caused by technical collapse and human error? Or was it something new, a Hiroshima without the bomb, where radiation was unleashed not by science alone, but by the cruelty of war? Around the world, the images replayed. The red glow of Chernobyl's burning core, the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima. The question that rose from Zaporizhzhia was chilling in its simplicity. Which path was closer to becoming real? A reactor melting from within, or an explosion triggered from without? And here lies the dilemma that no government has answered. Is Zaporizhzhia doomed to be remembered as a second Chernobyl? Or will it become the first nuclear plant in history turned into a weapon of war? What do you think? The echoes of the past hung heavy over the present, and as the generators coughed in the night, as artillery rumbled in the distance, the plant stood between two nightmares. Neither had come true yet, but both were waiting. The Zaporizhzhia plant was never meant to stand in the middle of a battlefield, yet that is exactly where it now exists, surrounded by trenches, artillery positions, and soldiers who measure the front line in meters from its walls. To the north, Ukrainian forces dig in, determined to reclaim what they see as their country's lifeline. To the south, Russian troops fortify their positions, using the plant as both shield and leverage. Between them stands a facility that was built to generate light, not to endure war. Shells have already fallen within the plant's perimeter. Windows shattered, buildings scarred, craters gouged into the earth uncomfortably close to reactor halls. Both Kiev and Moscow accuse each other of recklessness. Ukraine insists Russian forces are turning the reactors into a hostage, using them as cover. Russia counters that Ukrainian artillery is deliberately targeting the facility to create panic. The truth is buried under the smoke of war, but every blast brings the same danger, that one day a strike will land in the wrong place. The International Atomic Energy Agency has issued warning after warning, its inspectors walking the halls in body armor, their voices strained with urgency. This is the most dangerous nuclear situation since Fukushima, one report declared. But their words carry little weight against the reality of combat. Soldiers hear the alarms, see the flashing lights, but their orders come from generals who view the plant as territory first, risk second. The front line has crept so close that drone footage shows trenches carved into fields overlooking the cooling towers. Fighters move through abandoned villages, weapons strapped to their backs, the looming silhouette of the plant, a constant reminder that every shot fired risks something greater than victory or defeat. For those who work inside the facility, the war outside is a constant drumbeat of fear. Every distant explosion makes them flinch, wondering if this one will cut another power line, shatter another wall, or worse, pierce the containment of a reactor itself. They go about their duties under fluorescent lights, but behind their calm movements lies a dread they can never escape. Ukrainian officials demand that the world intervene, that the plant be turned into a demilitarized zone under international control. Russia refuses, knowing the plant's value as leverage. As long as Zaporizhzhia is in play, Moscow holds a weapon that doesn't need to fire a shot. The threat alone is enough to tie the world's hands. And here lies the most terrifying truth. The plant doesn't need to be hit directly to cause disaster. Power lines can be severed, diesel fuel can run out, cooling systems can fail from neglect. War doesn't have to strike the core to unleash catastrophe. It only has to keep pressing, keep grinding, until the fragile systems inside finally break. For now, the reactors hum, the generators thrum, and the engineers keep the danger at bay. But outside the fences, artillery still thunders, drones still circle, soldiers still fight for every field and road. Zaporizhzhia is not just a nuclear plant anymore. It is a hostage of war, and the ransom it demands is nothing less than the safety of an entire continent. Beyond Ukraine's borders, the alarm spread quickly. In Warsaw, officials quietly stocked iodine tablets, preparing for the unthinkable. In Bucharest and Bratislava, emergency plans were drafted, evacuation routes mapped, hospitals instructed to prepare for radiation exposure cases. Governments did not announce it openly, but their actions revealed the fear. If Zaporizhzhia failed, the fallout would not stop at Ukraine's borders. Across Europe, memories of Chernobyl returned with chilling clarity. Older generations remembered the days when children were kept indoors, when contaminated rain fell over fields, when milk and vegetables were thrown away by the ton. Now, that same fear crept back into living rooms, whispered in kitchens, carried through news reports. The question that spread from Poland to Germany to France was the same. Are we about to face another invisible cloud drifting silently across the continent? The energy markets reacted first. Prices for gas and electricity surged as investors imagined a worst-case scenario. Reactors destroyed, radiation spreading, trade disrupted, millions forced to flee. Oil climbed, markets trembled, and ordinary people felt it instantly in the rising cost of fuel and food. The war in Ukraine had already strained economies, but the threat of a nuclear disaster amplified the fear tenfold. In NATO headquarters, the dilemma deepened. Generals studied the maps, aware that the alliance could not ignore a nuclear threat in the heart of Europe. Yet direct military action to secure the plant risked escalation with Russia, a confrontation no one wanted to trigger. Diplomats urged restraint, scientists pleaded for intervention. But every option carried peril. Was it better to risk confrontation now or gamble that the plant would somehow hold until the war ended? In Moscow, the crisis became a tool of power. Russian officials spoke calmly, accusing Ukraine of recklessness while framing themselves as guardians of the plant. Every statement was a weapon, designed to divide Europe, to plant fear in Western capitals, to remind the world that Russia still held levers of influence no sanction could erase. In Beijing, the crisis was viewed through a different lens. Chinese analysts noted how vulnerable Western economies were to fear, how quickly markets collapsed at the whisper of nuclear risk. For them, Zaporizhzhia was not just a Ukrainian problem. It was a case study in how fragile the modern world truly was when faced with threats beyond missiles and tanks. And ordinary people watched in dread. Parents in Eastern Europe refreshed weather apps, wondering where the wind might carry radiation. Farmers feared their soil could be poisoned for generations. Families in Germany, France, and Italy asked themselves if another invisible cloud was about to creep across their skies, like it had decades before. The crisis no longer belonged to Ukraine alone. It belonged to the world. And so the question grew larger. Should NATO risk a clash with Russia to secure the plant and prevent catastrophe, or wait and pray that fragile generators and exhausted engineers can hold the line? What would you choose? The Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant still hummed in the night, its lights flickering like a heartbeat under siege. But the world around it held its breath, knowing that if it failed, the disaster would not stop at one border. It would spread, silent and merciless, across an entire continent. The towers of the Zaporizhzhia plant rose against the night like silent giants, their concrete walls glowing faintly in the moonlight. Inside, the hum of machinery was steady but fragile, every generator coughing like an old lung struggling for air. Engineers moved quietly through dim corridors, their faces lined with exhaustion, their eyes fixed on dials that measured not only pressure and heat, but the fate of millions. Outside, the war raged on. Artillery flashes lit the horizon, their echoes rolling across the river. The plant stood between armies, a prize no one dared to strike directly, yet one that both sides used as a shield. Soldiers patrolled its perimeter with rifles slung, knowing that their battlefield was not just land, but time itself. The time left before machines broke, before fuel ran out, before a single mistake unleashed something no army could control. Across Europe, families watched the news in silence, children asleep while parents stared at glowing screens, refreshing maps of wind directions, asking themselves how close the danger had come. In every capital, officials whispered the same fear, that one night soon, the hum of the reactors would stop, and with it, the illusion of safety. The plant has not failed yet. The lights still burn, the water still flows. But the world waits on a knife's edge, aware that the difference between survival and catastrophe may come down to one diesel engine, one cable, one shell falling a few meters too close. And so the haunting question remains: will Zaporizhzhia be remembered as a second Chernobyl, a slow-motion disaster unleashed by collapse, or as the first nuclear plant turned into a weapon of war? The reactors still stand, the generators still run, but the countdown has already begun.